This is Unsiloed, brought to you by Alumni FM, connecting people through stories.
Welcome to Unsiloed. This is Greg LeBlanc, and I'm here with Scott Shute, who is head of compassion and mindfulness programs at a little firm called LinkedIn, and also the author of this book right here, The Full Body Yes, Change Your Work and Your World from the Inside Out. Now, Scott, I have to say that sometimes when I refer to you as the Chief Mindfulness Officer.
Yeah.
I guess that's not the accurate title, but it more or less captures what you do at LinkedIn.
It does.
Is that right?
Yeah. First of all, thanks for having me. And yeah, the appropriate title is the one used, but sometimes we talk about Chief Mindfulness Officer, but sometimes people get sensitive about the word officer. You know, it takes on a different meaning in the corporate world. So Head of Mindfulness and Compassion Programs is the official title.
Yeah. Now it's interesting. I wonder if this is going to be a trend, right? I wonder if companies are going to have similar positions such as yours. And, I think that your role is twofold. I mean, on the one hand, you're involved in kind of internal development of people and helping people to learn new skills and learn how to flourish in different ways. But I think also you play a role in shaping the culture of the organization and how it responds to its customers and its constituents and its stakeholders. And you've written articles about, compassionate leadership. So maybe we can start with that and just sort of say, like, what does it mean to be a compassionate leader? And, why is this so important right now? And maybe another question is like, well, why haven't we been talking about this all along? I mean, isn't that sort of something that's intrinsic to leadership? Hasn't it always been something that's intrinsic to leadership? Or is this really a new conception of leadership?
Well, you'd think so. Wow. So many places to start. Maybe let's start with the history of work, just as a backdrop for all of this, right? Just in, 90 seconds. So if we think about the history of work, in the agrarian age, we had kings and slaves, right? If you think about the creation of the building of the pyramids, and for the last, X thousands of years up until the industrial age. And in other words, workers were not treated very well. And so managers could basically do whatever they want. It's like, I told you to do it, just do it, right? And then we moved into the industrial age and in the 1800s. And you might imagine a factory filled with workers doing exactly the same thing in a factory. And again, workers were probably not treated very well, were probably seen as replaceable. And therefore, managers could also, again, kind of go with this lead by power thing. But in the current age, in the information age, and not all companies have made it all the way to the information age, but a company like LinkedIn, we don't build products, in hard products. We don't have hard goods. We're not selling copper or cars. We have people. We're selling information. And so our employees are the most valuable asset that we have. And many companies are getting to this point where their employees are the most valuable assets they have. And when the other thing that happened, partially due to LinkedIn, is that now these employees have much more power in shaping their own careers. We're literally changing careers 3 or 4 or 5 times during our lifetime. We're changing jobs more than that. And we have the power to just, if we have a good LinkedIn profile and we have a good set of skills, companies recruit us to do different things. So the power is in the hands of the people. Well, that definitely shapes how leaders need to lead. Because now, if you lead by power and say something like, I told you to do it, just do it. Why haven't you done it yet?
I define compassion like this, so we can kind of teach to it
in 3 parts. The first part is having an awareness for the other person. The second part is having a mindset of kindness towards them, or a mindset of wishing the best for them. And then the third part is the courage to take action on their behalf. Now, this works for our employees. It also works for our customers. And we can dissect that, a little bit more. But this is kind of the framing that I use of why this is so important.
But I think there's a couple of things. I mean, one, I think in the book, you talk about how a compassionate mindset can lead to happiness, right? And so this is sort of an appeal to, almost interest. In the way you reference leadership, it's like, hey, if you want to have a successful company, you have to do this, which is also sort of an appeal to self-interest. But I think there's also a deeper message, which has to do with kind of virtue and a motivation that is aspiring for something that's more meaningful rather than something that's just about achieving success and
That's right.
having a good business and having happiness. Do you think that you need to use those appeals to happiness and appeals to higher quality business profitability as a way of kind of getting attention and get the message through, or is that an essential part of your message?
I think that we talk about it in different ways. Some people are motivated by different things, right? Some people just want to do the right thing. They just want to be a good person. And these practices of self-compassion and compassion for others, this is doing the right thing. And people who practice this just get that knowingness that this is the right thing to do. Turns out it's also really good for our business. So if I'm talking to C-suite levels, I give a very compelling case why the ROI on these programs and these practices is extraordinarily high. And even if you aren't interested in being a better person, if you want your business to be better, these are also the right practices. So it kind of depends on the person and the audience. But you asked a question before about why haven't we been talking about this all along? And it's a great question, and it's unclear to me. I think it's habit over the last 10,000 years of being leaders, but we're starting to see the research bear out that when we move away from power, leading by power into leading with emotional intelligence, or moving from thinking about just the me to thinking about the we or the whole, the research bears out that this is actually a way to build a more successful company, a way to build a more successful team, a way to be more successful as a person. So the time for this is now.
Yeah, and so I spoke with Barry Schwartz a while back, and he wrote a book called Why We Work, and he emphasizes again the history of work, and he says work used to be something that you had to do. It wasn't something that you associated with fulfillment or gratification or pleasure or anything. It was just you had to do it in order to obtain the resources to kind of pay for the rest of your life. And maybe in prior periods, bosses felt that if work is unpleasant and there's no way to really
Right.
you got to exercise power to kind of compel people, and compassion is just going to impact the bottom line in a negative way. And so is it just that labor markets are so much more competitive that we need people to be capable of working together. We need people to kind of, focus better. That this is where, what doing the right thing is now all of a sudden, profitable in ways that it wasn't before.
It certainly helps by the way that work has evolved, right? And so now we're in this place where I'll use maybe a different language. We've evolved as in consciousness, and our labor markets have changed. The two things have fit together. So now we can actually, by being a good person, I can actually deliver better results for my company and be personally more fulfilled, but also help other people be personally more fulfilled. So it's a little bit of a golden age in work.
You have an interesting story, because you grew up in rural Kansas, right?
I
And
did.
ultimately went on to become an engineer. But you describe in the book that you had some early life experiences that made you feel a bit different, a bit out of place, and that you had these kind of early, I don't know, interests, cravings, discoveries
Mm.
that led you to a mindset that's you know similar to what you have today. And you mentioned the
Mhm.
full body yes, right? This idea of the thing that the experiences that you had. Can you talk a bit about that, those early experiences and how they kind of drew you to your current position,
Sure.
and then talk about, like, you know, were these sort of separate domains in your world until you were able to
Mhm.
create the current position? Did you have to think of yourself as having separate kind of work and life, and only recently were able to, blend them and combine them?
Sure. So when I was a kid, so first of all, let me preface all this by saying everything we do at LinkedIn is completely secular. But I did come at this from a kind of a spiritual bent, if we want to make things, kind of put things in categories. When I was about 13, I discovered a spiritual practice, which was really important to me then and remains important to me now. And I think of it just as my truth, right? It doesn't have to be anybody else's truth, but it fits me. It fits my, what I believe in. And that included a contemplative practice. From the outside, looks like meditation. And I started that when I was 13. And, started teaching it in college. It's been a big part of my life ever since, but it was never something I talked about at work. I was covering, right? We talk about this, we have the inside of work life and the outside of work life. And then I got to LinkedIn you mentioned I was an engineer. To be clear, I have an engineering degree. I never went into engineering. I went into sales and then into customer service leadership. And so I arrived at LinkedIn, kind of 25 years into my career as the VP of Global Customer Operations. I was leading essentially all the customer-facing functions that aren't sales. But I quickly realized that LinkedIn was an amazing place. Our CEO at the time, Jeff Weiner, was talking about his own meditation practice using Headspace. And I was thinking, wow, maybe this is a place where I can bring this other part of me. Maybe I can lead a meditation at work. That would be really cool. This is my internal dialogue. It'd be really cool if I could bring that inner and outer part of me together and be a whole person at work. And so I started just by leading one meditation class. It was on a Thursday afternoon at 4:30 in the Heavenly conference room, which I thought was very auspicious. And that first time there was one person there. And I'm sure that guy was just as terrified as I was because I never saw him again. But the next week, because look, it took a lot for me to get over myself, to get over my own fear to even do this. I had all this self-doubt, like, what are people going to think of me? Like, is this weird? Like, what are people going to say? I'm a leader. Can I even do this here?
Wait, so does LinkedIn have a policy where people can sort of, run classes, organize classes? Is there a system by which you initiate these sorts of things?
In this particular case, I had met with my colleague, my friend who ran our wellness group and just, asked if there was anything that we could do together. He got really excited. I got really excited. And then I went back to my desk and did nothing about it for 3 months because I was afraid. But essentially it was in conjunction with, our wellness group at the time. Yeah. So this became a regular thing. The one person turned into 3, turned into 5. Then people knew that I did it. I started getting invited to bigger events. Like the CFO would have a summit with 300 or 400 finance people, and I would kick things off with a meditation. So all of a sudden, my inside person was the same identity as my outside person. And then our CEO, Jeff, gave the commencement address at Wharton 3 years ago and talked about compassion in leadership. And I was watching all this. I'd been in my ops role at this point for 6 years. I've been volunteering as a mindfulness person for 3 or 4 years. And I was thinking, okay, it's time. It's time for me to invest my career, like the center point of my career, into this. But it's also time for LinkedIn to invest in this. Because here, our CEO is out in the world talking about compassion, essentially saying that compassion is the most important thing you can do as a person for both work and your personal life. But then what are we going to do for the 16,000 employees of LinkedIn? We just sent them back to their desks with this message. So I made a pitch to him and our head of HR, and we essentially created this role with a bit of a blank piece of paper a few years ago. And it's been very good ever since. I can share some of the stuff that we do.
Well, so I'm familiar as a lot of companies have incorporated meditation into some of their wellness initiatives. And I think every company makes it very clear that this is intended to be sort of a secular activity. What do we mean by that? Like, why is it so important that we emphasize the secularity of it? I mean,
Sure.
For most of human history, right, religion has been a huge part of people's lives, and it certainly is for a lot of people today. But we now have substituted work for religion, right? Work is the religion of the 21st century. So, if we're going to make work kind of more religion-like, right?
Mm-hmm.
Why is that a problem? How do we how do we
Sure.
understand things as secular versus religious in a world
Sure.
where kind of work is our new religion?
It's a great question. My understanding, my own definition is the difference between secular and spiritual, let's say, or religious is one's connection with the divine or whatever word or belief system they want to put on that. Um, the first place I'd start is just we're trying to create environments that have a rich tapestry of belonging and inclusion. And, if I'm trying to get people to come to this meditation thing and they say, oh, well, I'm Christian or I'm Muslim, like I don't do that, or wherever they come from, or I'm atheist, then that's a shame because they're missing out on something that's really interesting. Where if we leave it wide open, that this is for everybody, this is a practice, you can think of it at the corollary as mental exercise versus physical exercise. Just like we provide a gym, we're going to provide these mental exercises and share with everybody the benefits of doing so. It doesn't mean that everybody does it, but at least, it's there and it's available. And then within the practice itself, when we do the practice, for sure, there are people who come at it from a spiritual perspective, but the words we're using are very inclusive. And if we're going inward, they themselves can make those connections, whatever their inward practice is, while we're doing the practice. But in the outer, if that's not your belief system, then it's also something that you can do, and that still feels good and feels inclusive in a work environment.
So I think some of the critics of wellness initiatives at large companies, they say, look, you create this horrible work environment that's super stressful, right? And it's full of horrible people, and there's all these crazy demands that are imposed on you, and people get burned out. And so we're going to remediate that with a little bit of mindfulness to kind of take
Yeah,
the edge off and make it so that people can run back to work. Kind of like, Google will give you snacks so that you can just, keep working late into the,
sure.
early morning hours without having to go home and have a proper meal. Um, I certainly think that's not what you're doing, right? I mean, you're
No.
trying to completely change the way people interact with one, which the work is done. But do do you need to have an integration? I mean, in other words, are there some companies that will view this as a separate thing from the work itself? How
Mm,
important is it that CEOs like Jeff Weiner, think about the entire kind of work design process as one that leads to a healthier employee base?
Sure. I think overall it's a balance, right? If everything else you do is terrible and you provide a mindfulness program, well, it's not that it's wasted, but it's certainly not, everything you can do. At LinkedIn, we're trying to create an environment where employees can do their best work, where they can be fulfilled, where they can be happy, where they can explore and develop their own growth. And of course, that's good for the company as well. But it's not like we're saying, hey, meditate so you can, deliver more, so you can produce more. So certainly we talk about two things. We talk about mindfulness and compassion in a very, conscious way. Mindfulness is a bridge word I use for lots of things, but essentially it's about the development of self, right? But then compassion is how we interact, how we work together. And for me, that's really where the juice is, because you can sell products compassionately. You can build products compassionately. You can learn to treat each other and our employees and everyone else compassionately. And it's having a whole system where I develop awareness of myself through mindfulness, but also I develop an awareness of others and that practice of living and working through compassion.
Do you think of compassion differently from empathy? Because
Yeah,
people talk, of course, about the importance of empathy when it comes to product design and other characteristics. But sometimes I think empathy can be used nefariously, right? Like, once I understand what makes my customer tick,
mm,
then I can you know I know which buttons to push. I know how to get them engaged and addicted or whatever. I mean, do you see these as different concepts?
I do. The simple definition, it's maybe not 100% accurate, is I think of empathy, I think of compassion as empathy plus action. But if you go back to my definition of compassion, so it's an awareness of others, it's a mindset of wishing the best for them and the courage to take action. Let's talk about some examples of how we operationalize compassion. So as an example, our head of sales will stand in front of whatever, 5,000 or 6,000 salespeople at kickoff and say, look, our job as salespeople is to provide long-term value. So don't sell something our customers don't need at the end of the quarter just so you can hit your quota. Right? To me, that's amazing, right? That is not how I was trained as a 25-year-old salesperson. It happens in product development. So we have product review meetings. It's essentially a product manager's talking about the next rev of their product within LinkedIn. They meet with the product executives to say, here's what we're going to do and here's the results, right? So these happen 5 or 6 times a week. And if the meeting starts and the product manager is talking about their new product, hey, we're going to get 13% more engagement, 13% more clicks with these new feature. If they don't answer the following question, it will always be the first question. And that is, okay, great. Well, what's the member experience like? And if the answer is, well, hey, did I mention it was 13% more clicks? The meeting just kind of stops, and then it becomes a discussion about our number one value, which is members first. Because at LinkedIn, we know that our business is built on our members. So going back to compassion and awareness of others, in other words, what do our customers really want? A mindset of wishing the best for them. In other words, how can I solve their problem? How can I help them be successful? And then the third one, which is the hard one, which is the courage to take action, right? So sometimes we as a company need to take action on behalf of our customers in a way that's not good for us in the short term. Of course it would be better if we sold, a package of services that was worth 10x the price that our customers don't need. Of course it would be better for us in the short term, but over the long term, that is terrible business, right? Because the customer is going to realize they don't need it. And over the long term, they're going to go find a different solution. So these are a few ways that we practice compassion and how it's operationalized. And we're not perfect, but this is the intent that's behind what we do.
So are there ways that you can kind of compute metrics around, say, being compassionate? And I mean this at a couple different levels, right? So in performance reviews, right? Can you look at individual employees and say, hey, this person is, a 4 on the compassion metric, and we need to, figure out a way to coach them up. And then, on the company level, I work with a lot of pension funds that are interested in kind of ESG metrics and other sorts of things. Could we actually say, hey, this company is more compassionate than the other companies? And if so, right, how do they deal with the trade-offs? So Amazon famously is, customer. And some people argue that, employees take a backseat to the customers.
Sure.
If that's true, I'm not saying that's true, but, would you need to have some integration function which would enable you to say, well, compassion, you have to, weigh these different kind of stakeholders and into your, overall kind of compassion metric?
Sure. Let's break it down between the two things. So you talked about managers. Interestingly enough, I'm working on something exactly like what you just said. So we have this definition of compassion. We've broken it down further into the 11 or 12 behaviors of a manager or a leader that fall into these 3 categories. Awareness of others, or things like listening, a mindset of kindness, and you can break that into behaviors, or the courage to take action and break that into behaviors. Then imagine you put that in a leadership 360. And so your team, if I'm a leader, my team is then giving me feedback on a scale of 1 to 10. How well did I do against these 12 categories? And from that, I can develop a compassion index, right? You could have the compassion index at the leader level, at the team level, even at the company level, as described by employees. And then at LinkedIn, ultimately, if I find that I'm light on, say, number 3 and number 7, wow, there's LinkedIn Learning that can help me boost those skills. So this
Essentially productize our ability to shape compassion. So I think that's easier at the individual behavior level.
Now, if we start talking about the company level, it gets trickier. But I do think over time we'd be able to share things like, from LinkedIn data, we'd be able to share, okay, what companies treat their employees compassionately using the data I just mentioned. If we had more data at the global level, and probably companies are collecting these, we could get that data from, what customers think of the firms they're dealing with. And then truly it's to build if we really measuring it, like my belief is that it needs a balance of all your stakeholders, not just your shareholder.
how you treat employees, how you treat customers, the bottom line, where you need a good business model, and then the broader environment
or the society that we live in. If we had a balance of those things, I do think that over time we could measure and create lists of companies who are doing this well.
So you can imagine in a learning and development function, right? Sort of classes in compassion, or
Sure.
a program that one could go through to kind of learn how to become more compassionate. And I think you're very people. I think you believe that most people really want to be compassionate, and if they're not, it's only because they're unaware of how to do it, or they're lacking some self-knowledge. But aren't there people that are just, I don't know, psychopaths,
Oh, of course.
or
Of course.
narcissists? I remember I was
course.
reading a chapter, whenever we read about, love yourself.
Yeah.
I always think there's a number of people for whom that's not the problem. Right?
Of course.
That might be something you want to reverse. How do we identify the kind of people that are going to really respond well to this sort of training, and to what extent is compassion and mindfulness, are they kind of tightly connected, or are they kind of severable? You hear about
Sure.
these people who meditate right before they go into battle, and cut people's
Right.
heads off and so forth, right?
Oh my goodness.
I mean, I don't know, maybe that's fiction, but is there a necessary connection, do you think, or are these sort of potentially non-overlapping things?
I think mindfulness and compassion go together. It doesn't mean, and when I say mindfulness, I use it in the broadest sense of the word, of self-awareness, right? It doesn't have to be meditation, but introspection. People who are introspective, they have some self-awareness, maybe they have a practice. By nature, they have more capacity to then have awareness of others, right? If someone has self-love versus self-hatred, then they have a more capacity to have a mindset of kindness or love towards others. And if they have the courage to act on their behalf, to take responsibility for their own lives, then of course they have more of a chance to have, the capacity to help others. So they are interrelated. And that's certainly the intention of how we're talking about it at LinkedIn. So let's see, your other line of questioning was, there are terrible people in the world and amazing people in the world. Here's how I think about this. I was having a conversation with one of my colleagues who's a very senior leader at LinkedIn. And we were talking about the culture, because LinkedIn is a very open, amazing place. And it's just different than other places I've been. And I was asking this person what their experience was like at other cultures, and if they liked, the LinkedIn culture. And they were very reflective. They were very self-aware. They said, I don't like to admit it, but what I'd say is I'm pretty malleable, right? This person had worked in a consulting firm, a very kind of hard-nosed consulting firm. And he said he pretty much acted like everybody else did at that consulting firm. But given the chance to act in a different way at LinkedIn, he chose to do that, and he liked to do that. And he was able to open up and be so much more of himself and such a better person. So this is what I think about creating a company culture. So if you have leaders at the top who create this umbrella of expectation that we're going to operate in a certain way, it allows the rest of us to then go, oh, I can be a good person and I can be successful. Like, I don't have to be a jerk to move up the ladder here. And so the company culture totally shapes the consciousness. And back to what I think, that companies have the opportunity to shape consciousness in a way that religions and governments have been doing for thousands of years. So it's really a beautiful place that is possible. Of course, not every company is taking advantage of that, but it's possible.
Yeah, and one of the pathology I think that you point out in the book is really this need for people to comparing themselves to others, and how this can, have very detrimental effects. But in a way, I mean, don't we need a little bit of that in order to create a culture, right? Because part of the culture is we kind of always remind each other, hey, these are the principles, and you when you fail to live up to them, or you 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 disappoint yourself in a way, right?
Sure.
And that sort of is a mechanism to kind of encourage you to kind of move forward.
Sure.
Do we need to have some element of kind of interpersonal comparison? And if we do kind of create a compassion metric, and we kind of
Yeah.
start assigning numbers and saying, you're only a 3 on the compassion index, is that going to trigger that internal kind of pathology of comparison?
Sure. Well, there's a lot we could talk about here in terms of, is competition a good thing and when does it become a bad thing? Because I grew up as a very competitive person, right? And business by nature is fairly competitive. And so what's the good and what's the bad? Well, let's start with comparison to others. Comparison to others can be extraordinarily helpful, right? If I'm younger in my career and I'm looking up at a leader, I'm going to mimic that leader's behavior if it's someone that I respect or someone who has a job that I want, right? So some amount of comparison to say, oh, wow, this person did really well. I want to find out what they did so I can emulate that. That's helpful. What's not helpful if we spend our entire lives thinking about our own success in comparison to others, especially our peers, right? Oh, Joe started.
Now he's been promoted 2 times and I'm in my same
Job. And I'm defining my happiness as a comparison of me versus others. That's where it gets not helpful, right? And, one of the premises in my book is that we have been defining success in the wrong way. We've been defining success from external validation. What do other people think about us? In other words, what's our title? What's the amount of money that we have? What's the amount of status that we have? And some of that is okay, if that's natural to be successful. But the real, measuring lens that I think that we should use is our own internal happiness. Are we content? Are we fulfilled? And certainly in business, there's a way to talk about both of these things and have both of them. But we've certainly been overweighted on the comparison and competitive angle.
Well, you talk a lot about feedback and how, people need to be open to feedback, but also how important it is that you give feedback in a positive way. And you recounted 2 stories, one where you were on the kind of receiving end of some feedback, right? Early in your
Yeah.
career. And then another example where you had to, provide feedback and then you saw yourself, you realized the parallels between those 2 situations.
Mhm.
So, how, if obviously your internal judge is important, but, how do you open yourself up so that you can, use that your internal measure of self is open to modification, that you can learn
Sure.
from others and help to use a better metric when you're
Sure.
understanding yourself.
Sure. Well, one of the beauties of getting older is that we see all the mistakes, like us to see what went well and what didn't go well. And as a leader, that's super helpful because then we can help guide people that are younger or have less cycles of experience. In terms of getting feedback, when we are more comfortable in our own skin, right? We're not so worried about what everybody else says. We're actually, it's interesting because then it allows us to be more vulnerable. And in that vulnerability, it allows us to take on feedback, to say, oh, well, I can really hear what you're saying without getting so triggered, right? When we're constantly measuring ourselves by what someone says or what the external perception is,
it has so much.
deeper consequence to us. But when we ourselves are stable, then we're able to hear it and we're able to grow and we're able to be more self-aware. And that leads to
Growth and professional growth, and then also the ability to be a better leader.
Right. And then when you're giving feedback to people, right, how do you make sure that you're listened to and that they, can benefit from your feedback and that they're not,
sure.
they don't put in place mechanisms to kind of defend themselves against the feedback?
I think a useful place to start is to share our common goal, right? So look, I'm going to give you feedback and I'm doing this because I want you to be really successful, right? And so first I'm going to ask, are you open to that feedback? right? Because if maybe you're having a bad day and it's just, you're not in that place, and maybe you're having a good day and you are in that place. But starting from this place of, I'm only telling you this so that you have told me you want to be better at your job. I want to help you get better at your job. And to do that, I have some things to share. Are you open to hearing that? And this is a much different place to come at versus, hey, I need to tell you the 3 things you did wrong last week. Because then when I hear that, it just puts my defenses up, and I'm going to agonize over those 3 things.
Yeah, I mean, you talk about the fight or flight response, right? And how
Mhm.
your amygdala, how this gets in the way of so much. And it's kind of puzzling, right? Why is it that we allow this fight or flight response to kick in so often? I mean, at the end of the day, when you go to work and you have a meeting and, you got to get out and take your kid to baseball practice, whatever. I mean, your life is not in danger like at any point during this
Yeah,
entire 24-hour cycle. Well,
that's right.
maybe, you could be in an accident on the highway or whatever, but why is it that we go through life in this state of mind as if we are under, serious
Sure.
threat?
Under
We
attack.
we forget the night, remember the 99%, which is the good stuff, and
Yeah.
don't emphasize the 1%. Is this
Yeah.
just sort of a survival strategy? Is it maladaptive? Is it designed for an environment that's very different from the one that we live in?
I think so. I mean, we evolved this way, right? We evolved from the apes that were not the chilled out apes. We evolved from the anxious and nervous apes because they were the ones who noticed everything and stayed alive. And so now our fight or flight system, our amygdalas are always busy looking for danger. And dangers is still real, right? If a bus is careening around the corner and we're standing in front of it, that's a real thing. And we need to have fight or flight to be able to move quickly out of the way. But our bodies also get triggered by our kids who are arguing in the next room while we're trying to do a Zoom call, or they get triggered by an angry customer email, or pretty much everything in our life is a possibility to trigger that same system. So we've evolved this way. And so it's up to us, until evolution kind of catches up with that, it's up to us to shift our mindset to realize that our natural instinct is to spend 99% of our brain power, our mind power, on the things that might kill us, the things that are dangerous. And I'm not saying that we don't pay attention to them, but let's shift our thinking so that we're more balanced, right? We tend to have this negativity bias. I call it pothole management, right? There can be 1,000 miles of perfect road and there's one pothole. Okay, where do we spend almost all of our time in our team meetings, right? We're talking about the one pothole. How do we fix it? Our team meetings or our relationships or wherever. And it's not that we ignore the pothole. It's just that what's the 999 other things that are also true to balance it out? And by doing that, this is true mindfulness, right? Having awareness of the full situation without judgment. And that leads to much better solutions. It leads to our ability to have gratitude for each other. It leads us to our ability to see the things that have gone well and replicate those.
Now, do you think, I mean, we have a workplace environment where people are kind of constantly turning over
Mm,
work for a year, maybe 2 years in a single place. I mean, you've been at LinkedIn
mm,
for longer than that, but
mm.
I think it's something that's a little bit unusual. Do you think that constant churn, that constant movement, it impedes the formation of community? And is there a way that mindfulness practices and compassion can kind of strengthen those bonds, which would normally kind of be frayed? Does it allow us to achieve a level of intimacy and friendship more quickly than it would take if we were not in this constant churning environment?
It's a great point. I do, yes, think that build community
Awareness.
and
That allows us to have more capacity to be aware of others. And when we're aware of others,
we tend to be closer to them, right? So there's a quote by Abraham Lincoln and he said, I'll paraphrase for today's language. He basically said, I don't like that guy. I must get to know him better, right? And so when we're constantly if we're in this movement and we're constantly surrounded by new people, and if we're only thinking about ourselves, we're going to be very isolated, right? We're going to be just thinking about our own success. How can I essentially use this environment for my own good? But if we drop into it and we see others as equal, if we see the system as something that we're part of, and we're thinking about how can we improve the system instead of just thinking about ourselves, then we do start to build more of a community. You start to build more of a connection with others. I actually think that's really critical in today's world. We have this pandemic of coronavirus that we're living through, but we also have a pandemic of loneliness. We have a pandemic of isolation. We have a pandemic of mental unwellness. And a big part of that is a lack of connection. So while mindfulness compassion is not the panacea for all this, it does help us build those connections with others and to that deepest part of ourselves where we can feel more stable and resilient.
Yeah, and I think there's studies that show that people who have friends at work are more likely to not only stay on the job, but more likely to they avoid burnout. They become more fulfilled and they enjoy their work more. So, do you think that it's the role of companies to promote friendships, promote connections, to build communities? That's sort of part of the job, and if that's true, is that really part of the job of, say, an HR function? So I teach a course on the future of work, and I sometimes think of it as an HR course, and I actually had you come in and speak to that class a couple years ago. And I think it's kind of a misnomer because HR traditionally has been, sort of, I don't know, just this cost center. It hasn't really
Yeah.
been the place where all this happens. And I don't think you're sitting in an HR department, right? So
I actually am. I report into
you are,
learning and
okay.
development. I am.
So now you're in HR. So
But
this
is it-
something that is like, an HR job, or is this really the job of the leadership? Is this part of a strategy? Is this really central to the organization?
I think it's kind of like saying, is leadership in an HR job? And no, I don't think so. I think HR has a place to play in helping codify the culture and helping codify practices and operationalizing things. But ultimately, it's up to each individual leader to create culture, to create connections. So here's an example of something we do at LinkedIn, which I think builds connectivity. At the beginning of nearly every staff meeting, in other words, a meeting where we already know each other, one of the things we do before just dropping right into business is just a quick go around. Whoever wants to share, it's like, hey, what's something you're grateful for today before we get started? Or perhaps what's a personal, professional win you'd like to share? What's something you did over the weekend? And in the beginning, this can feel like, wow, are we really going to spend 7 minutes of our 1 hour talking about this? But what we realize is this is how you build connection, right? This is how you build that sense of connectivity. And so while it may not look like work, it is, because what it does is, first of all, in that meeting, it moves people from their head to their heart. It moves people from thinking about just themselves to the whole. It allows us to get to know each other so that when something happens, if things start to have a little friction, we're in a much better place to deal with whatever that friction is. And so over the long run, again, it's a short term versus long term. Over the long term, we move so much faster. We move so much quicker because we've spent the time getting to know each other and building connections. So who is responsible for that? It's every single leader at the company.
Yeah, and I think there's a study I think it was Atul Gawande who wrote about this with the doctors when they go in for surgery. When all the people at the operating room kind of introduce themselves, the accident rate goes down substantially, right? Because people
Right.
feel comfortable raising questions and issues with one another.
That's right.
We're one-to-one.
That's right. Yeah, we're way more open to bringing up the good
Be fixed.
We're going to improve it.
So, when we mentioned that people are constantly switching jobs, I think one of the ways in which you can attract someone to work at a particular place, it's not just, the time they have there is going to be enjoyable and fulfilling, but also people are thinking about, what new skill set will they acquire when they are working there that they can take with them. And most people think in terms of, I don't know, some new business skill. Normally people don't think about going to work at a company and then coming away with a new
Right.
spirit capacity or an improved character or a more virtuous disposition. Is this something that LinkedIn can use as a competitive advantage in recruiting and say, hey, when you give this job, you will actually have cultivated this sense of compassion and mindfulness?
That is a great question. I don't know how often we do that, but I do think it exists, right? Because of the way we operate. I do think that people come out of it being, especially managers, being much, much better managers. Because I do think it's more challenging to be a compassionate manager than a command and control fear-based manager. And because it's required in our environment, you have to learn those skills. Of course, you're going to leave being a better leader. What I do know is that this work that we're doing is a talent magnet. I've had several people come up to me who are now LinkedIn employees, and they meet me doing a workshop or a program, and they're like, I'm at LinkedIn because I saw you speak at blah, blah, blah conference. And I thought, oh my God, if there's a company that has a head of mindfulness and compassion, I want to work there. And so they were drawn to LinkedIn just because we're doing this type of work. So I do think that our culture as a whole, for sure, is a talent magnet. And even specifically, the concept around compassion and mindfulness is a talent magnet.
Yeah, I was thinking, the military, they'll advertise, come here and you'll learn discipline. And, you'll learn all the leadership skills and all this other stuff. And they're not asking for a lifetime commitment. They're just asking for, and then they send you on your way.
Right. That's right. I think something similar. Well, that's a great idea. That was worth the price of admission. Now I can go talk to our head of recruiting and talk about that.
But do you think that it's easier? I mean, look, LinkedIn's a company that's very profitable. It's growing like crazy. I mean, it's in the software space. Every employee probably brings in, over $1 million worth of revenue. I don't know the exact number, if it's comparable to Facebook or it's going to be, it's a very lucrative job company and it's not faced with enormous competitive pressures. Do you think that it's a lot more difficult when you're dealing with a company that perhaps in a declining industry that's fighting for its life, that has price wars that where there's kind of layoffs and there are people fighting for their jobs? I mean, those seem to be environments where the compassion would be even more important, but it seems like it's very difficult to sustain.
Just think of it like a relationship, right? If you're with your partner and things are hard, you can't make the bills, one of you just got fired, somebody is sick, you're in the middle of trauma. Is it harder to be nice to each other? Yeah, of course it's harder. Is it needed at that point? More than ever.
More so.
More so. And, organizations are just groups of people. And so when the organization of this group of people is going through something hard, of course it's harder. And especially, all of these things we're talking about, mindfulness and compassion, are best in the long term, right? So if you're facing short-term pressures, right? If you're a company that is under short-term pressure and you just need to hit your number for this quarter or you're going to go out of business, wow, it's really tempting to do the quote wrong thing, right? To sell something your customers don't need or to lie in your marketing or in your sales. And so every company, every person has to decide who they want to be over the long term, right? And if it's worth it to kind of break those boundaries or to break what you know to be right to survive. In the same way that as an individual, if you're in a tough place, is it okay to do the wrong thing with your spouse or your partner just to get by? These are very challenging. So of course it's easier at a company that is profitable, that basically has the wind at its back. But these are practices they're good for all of us.
Of course. So how would you get this into these other companies? You spent time working in Japan, for instance.
I did.
And, Japan is it's a very different environment. The salarymen, their lives are very, very different from that of an employee at a place like LinkedIn. I did some work for the HR department of a large European company and escorted them to Silicon Valley, and we showed them all this great stuff that is happening in all these companies. And I talked about how important it was to attract and retain the best people and keep people from quitting. And the head of HR for that company said, "Well, our employees don't quit; they just commit suicide."
Yikes.
And I thought, wow, in when you're in the valley, you kind of get insulated and isolated, and you forget that the outside world is concerned with things that are very from the things that we are dealing with in our bubble.
That's
Here
right.
in Silicon Valley. So it seems like the org and the companies that really need compassion the most and really need mindfulness the most are the ones that kind of have the least of it. How do you convince kind of senior leaders at these other organizations, these other cultures that this is something worth pursuing?
Sure. I go back to the history of work, right? If I'm talking to the C-suite, my first question is, do you care about your employees, right? Where are you in this agrarian, industrial, information age, evolution? Because if you don't care about your employees, if they're just replaceable, you can just go get some more, then I'm not going to waste my time, right? There's lots of companies who care, who I can spend my time on. So it starts there. And then it just goes into this, this further logic plan, right? If they really care about their employees, right? And they want to provide resources so their employees can be at their best. We talk about physical exercise as an example. Okay, your company has a lot of people. Do you offer a gym? Oh yeah, we offer a gym. Well, why do you do that? Well, because we want people to be physically healthy because we know that they're at their best. All right, great. Well, the same thing can be said of mindfulness. Just think about it as mental exercise, right? Because for most companies, in the information age, do you need your employees to be able to lift 100 pounds or to be able to run a 6-minute mile? Probably not. But do you need them to be emotionally stable? Do you need them to be mentally focused? Absolutely. So it becomes pretty evident within 3 or 4 minutes of this line of questioning. It's like, oh yeah, this could be really valuable. Now you still might have, cultural differences, right? And so this is why it's so important that mindfulness specifically, meditation specifically, needs to be secular. It's like, oh yeah, well that mindfulness stuff, like that's just for pick your religion. But no, this is the practice that's good for all of us. So that's where I start, just in this basic human, do you care about your employees? And if you do, then it becomes self-evident that these are practices that are going to be valuable for the company and the employees as well.
I want to push back towards kind of education, because look, if you have to wait until you're in the workplace to learn that mental training is important and that compassion is important, I mean that's kind of a problem. I mean, in school you learn accounting and you learn finance, maybe you learn how to code. Should this be a part of education?
Absolutely.
At the business school level or earlier? We have initiatives at business at my business school around mindfulness, but it's really what we call co-curricular or student-led. It's not really an integral part of the education. It's sort of a it's like you said. I mean, we have gym membership, and we can yoga classes, and it's available to us, but it's not something that we see as a core skill that people need to have. At what point should we be thinking about making this an integral and formal part of business education, technical education, all aspects of education?
Sure. I think starting with kindergarten and preschool and then all the way through all levels of education. In fact, not associated with LinkedIn, but Jeff Weiner has a project called the Compassion Project, and it's designed to bring compassion curriculum into grade schools.
Basically to every single grade school and middle school in America first.
And then the world. I think that's where it starts, because if you have a way to talk about this in the very beginning, where it's not strange, it's part of the mainstream, it just makes it so much easier for then us to layer on more of the nuance as we get older and things get more complicated.
And so a lot of people argue that the tech sector in general is probably doing a lot to kind of reduce people's mindfulness capabilities and their compassion capabilities. And so, one of the reasons why people need it so badly is because the external environment, the economy, the the social media, and everything else is doing everything to kind of dull those capabilities, right? How can companies, particularly social media companies, um, kind of avoid exacerbating the need for mindfulness?
Sure.
How can they behave responsibly and help to um,
Sure. You're not
create the
wrong.
problem?
I think if we think about, again, the definition of compassion, awareness of others, mindset of wishing the best for them, courage to take action, that means I'm really trying as a company to meet my customers' needs. And so right now, some companies, their success metrics are how long did the user spend on our site? Well, is that value? Right. So one of the things we're trying to do at LinkedIn is shift our goals from being just self-centered to being we-centered, right? So as an example, a number of years ago, we added jobs, right? And companies could put their jobs on LinkedIn. And when it was new, we were very proud every time it hit some milestone. Oh, we have 100,000 jobs and now 1,000,000 jobs and now 5 million jobs on LinkedIn. And at some point we changed the metric because we realized well, actually, that's not the most important thing. The most important thing is, did anybody get value out of that? So we changed the primary metric to confirmed hires, right? Because that's good for both the company who's paying us to have their job on LinkedIn, but it's also good for a member who's trying to find the job. So if companies created metrics that were customer-centric, value-centric, instead of company-only centric, then it would lead to better results.
So that's a dating site that encourages marriages and not just,
Right.
swiping, right?
Exactly. Right. And you're not wrong. I mean, we have some serious challenges ahead of us, right? The way that a lot of these media company works is the success metric is only eyeballs. It's only how much time did they spend, how many users, what's the level of engagement. Because if their only model is advertising, then that's the only part of the business model. But if we can come up with other models where we're providing real value to the users, then we'll all be better off.
You describe in the book how you took a bunch of personality tests and this kind of helped you figure out what kind of person you are. Can you see a day where, when we're interviewing people for jobs, that we'll be able to kind of dig in and see kind of, how mindful are they? How compassionate
Oh,
are
wow.
they?
Okay. I thought you're headed in a different direction.
I was wondering,
Yeah.
how capable they are, or how much potential is there? Are these things
Yeah.
that you think we'll be able to, as these employees become more and more valuable, more and more productive? How do we evaluate that? Are we going to be able to test for that? Are we going to be able to, or is it just, oh, this person, they spend time at LinkedIn, or they spend time,
Yeah. Well,
some other entity where it's
if you just look at in the last 100 years, how much things have changed, how much data we have about our own selves, like the wearables that we have, it tracks our heart rates and all these other things. Imagine a world where the wearable told you all kinds of things that are now not accessible to us. Even with compassion, how much of the time am I tracking eye contact with the person that I'm talking to, as an example? Or how many, triggering words did I use in my language versus empathetic words did I use in my language? Over time, wow, of course, we'll be able to track so much more of that. Then I don't know about the ethics behind it, but we'll probably have the data, and those will be some interesting discussions we'll be having about that over time.
So for those of you who are applying for a job at LinkedIn, when you go down for the interview, see someone in the hallway who appears to be in need of help, do not step over that person.
Yeah. It might just be a test.
Right? Exactly.
No,
Exactly.
we're not doing that test, but that would be interesting, wouldn't it? Yeah.
Right. Yeah, I think actually people will, the amount of data that we have at our disposal now, and the different ways that we can evaluate people, I'm pretty sure that we will figure out ways to identify these attributes. I just hope that if we identify people who don't have these attributes, that we don't give up on them, that we
Right.
Right. appreciate the fact that we help people and educate people
For
with the
sure.
tools that they.
And if we have the data, hopefully whoever's in charge is using it for good, right? Because like everything else, the more data we have, it can be used for good and for not good. So this is why the mindfulness compassion goes together, because as we practice mindfulness, we essentially rise in consciousness, right? And so then we're more likely to do things for good reasons instead of just for our own selfish reasons.
Well, Scott, I really enjoyed talking to you. I can't give away all the secrets of the book. There's some wonderful stories in here, lots of very personal anecdotes. It's a really, I think, deeply personal book, and it really does reveal a lot about yourself and your journey. And I hope that we will see more chief mindfulness officers,
Yes.
compassion officers at companies. Although once that proliferates, it'll be a lot more difficult to differentiate.
That's just fine. That is just fine. We'll find some new way by then.
Okay, so Full Body Yes, check it out. Thanks so much, Scott.
This is Unsiloed, brought to you by Alumni FM, connecting people through stories.